Do not count on Western love. There will be none. And one must understand that first and foremost, one should think not the way our Western experts do. What will they say? Earlier it was, what will the West say? And now it is, what will China and India say if we suddenly strike with nuclear weapons? What will China or India say if we lose and our state ceases to exist? What, will they send flowers to the grave? We must win. Victors are not judged. And if someone thinks that we will be pitied, that they will stop, do not entertain any illusions.
Russians have completely lost it over the idea of Ukraine getting a nuclear bomb. Of course, there is zero real evidence to support this nonsense. None. But hey, if Russian intelligence releases a talking points memo, someone has to go on TV and perform it. And perform they do. Threats included. Now let's translate this from propaganda into plain English. Things are going badly on the front lines. And apparently this nuclear fairy tale is the only way left to explain their failures. Wave a scary bomb on TV, call it geopolitics, and hope no one notices it's really just a very loud excuse for losing. New week, new Russian nonsense. I'm Sophia and this is Spin Snipers, where we tear apart Kremlin drama and serve up the brutal facts fast.
Why even start this whole story with the nuclear bomb? What does that mean you are admitting that you have lost in the situation that exists, and that this is the only way to somehow escalate the situation? Or what, do you have no other arguments left for conducting negotiations? Here I would of course like to support Maria Zakharova, who put it correctly about them. If Europeans are going to sit at the negotiating table at all, it will only be under the table. That is where they belong. Therefore, against this background, Europeans have long looked like.
Why start this whole story with a nuclear bomb? Well, that's a question for them. Here is the deal. In Kyiv, nobody is dreaming about this nonsense, but in Moscow, they've cooked up yet another ridiculous story. Apparently, the UK and France are getting ready to hand Ukraine nuclear weapons. Sure, that would be convenient for Kyiv. But in reality, this story is just for Russian audiences, to distract them from the real mess. Setbacks on the front lines, 4 years of war with zero real victories, internal failures. So what do? Invent a nuke and the propagandists happily deliver the script, line by line, starting from the Kremlin playbook.
And then Ukraine gets nuclear weapons. Ukraine strikes Russia. Russia destroys Ukraine. Well, great. The West won't be touched, they think. And Russia will become a pariah state, they think. And that's it. It can be forgotten. Maybe they'll play around with something else later.
That is exactly the logic of Kubrick style, that nothing will be done to them.
Of course. And what would they be punished
as a continental power, will once again be dragged into the shit, just as the British have done before. Right now, Keir Starmer is playing along with them. They thought the British were on their side, but when the moment comes, they will turn away, and continental Europe will once again end up in the shit.
In this defensive war which Ukraine is forced to fight, unlike Russia's offensive campaign, the idea that Kyiv could launch a nuclear strike on Moscow is simply absurd. And this whole story about nuclear weapons being handed over is just another way to scare the West, especially Europe, right in their own studios. Meanwhile, the propagandists are loudly screaming about a Ukrainian strike, even though, let's remind everyone, Kyiv doesn't have nuclear weapons, while the Russians themselves openly threaten the West.
They make these pompous statements. Now we are financing the war for Ukraine ourselves, Europeans. And they're proud of it. Proud of what, exactly? How is this going to end for you? For you, Kubrick style? That's the question.
I'm sure it will end with nothing bad.
Well, that's what they think. But how can it end with nothing bad?
And how exactly could this end for Europe? Under the banner of Russophobia, Europe as a whole will be dragged into Nazi-style principles. The elite that is pushing this will create jobs for itself.
Sure, it's clear they'll create jobs for themselves, but in the end, this could lead to a nuclear catastrophe.
You know, they still have to live long enough to get there. They're bureaucrats. What worries them is how to survive the next appointment cycle. They think in completely different categories, especially at that age. I'll die anyway, so why should the world live after me?
It really feels like that's exactly how they think. After us, let the grass not grow.
That's exactly how they think. That is precisely how they think.
Why should the world live after me? Sounds like the dictator Putin talking to himself. For the sake of his own goals, he's turned Russia into a global outcast, collapsing the economy, becoming the most sanctioned country in the world, and leaving ordinary Russians struggling to breathe financially. But the nonsense doesn't stop there. Next up, the propagandists invent absurd stories about where Ukraine might supposedly strike. Knowing Russia, this is really just them leaking their own plans under a cloak of fear, but it's spun as if Ukraine is threatening the world. And while they keep pushing these scary tales, the real story is simple. Moscow is stuck in the corner, scrambling to justify its own failures.
And of course, a brilliant idea, the nuclear bomb. How cleverly they fooled everyone, right? When I said in this studio that it would come to this, that Britain and France would give them a nuclear warhead. And then what? Where do you put it? One warhead makes no difference. 2 warheads, 10, none of that matters. This is not a weapon of deterrence against Russia, but it is a terrorist weapon. Where would they strike? Moscow. They understand they won't reach Moscow. They would strike nuclear power plants if they could. And then they'll say, it wasn't us. It's a Russian-made technological disaster. And then the IAEA will issue statements saying what a horror this is, that Russians are completely incapable of ensuring the safety of nuclear power plants. And that's it.
And of course, the Russians didn't stop there. To fully follow their Kremlin playbook, they've already explained how Ukraine could supposedly get these nuclear weapons. According to them, it would arrive through foreign deliveries, classic fantasies that only sound serious on Russian TV. In reality, it's just another way to scare their own audience and blame the West for plotting against Russia.
There is no longer any doubt. And the Foreign Intelligence Service has shown this very clearly. Nuclear weapons are an object of desire. And the attempts now to say, come on, what nonsense is this? Of course it's not nonsense. They let it slip themselves, and Flamingo Vpolnya can serve as a nuclear weapons carrier. And considering that a significant part of Ukraine's military-industrial complex has now been moved abroad, I would not be surprised if nuclear weapons as such were made multi-component. It's clear that you can't just make a warhead like that. But something here, something there, bits and pieces. Who is going to check the borders? They'll bring it in. They'll bring it in. And then they'll say, oh, terrorists smuggled it in. Oh, the Russians did it themselves. Therefore, we must not wait. We must destroy.
If Ukraine obtains nuclear weapons, we do not know from whom or how. If that happens, Russia would have the right to distribute nuclear weapons to those countries it deems necessary. And I assure you, that would be a catastrophe for them.
This is how the Russians openly threaten the West over a so-called nuclear weapon that Ukraine doesn't even have. And of course, they couldn't skip the peace talks. According to their Kremlin playbook, it's Europe that's supposedly dragging its feet, never Russia, the country that started the war and destroys cities. In short, their propaganda twists reality to make the West look guilty, even though it's Russia causing all the problems.
Indeed, the British are looking for any way to drag out the Ukrainian conflict in order to sabotage the peace process. They seem to have completely lost control. As you mentioned, an article by Hilly appeared in the Sunday Times saying that they are ready at any moment. As soon as a ceasefire or peace begins, to deploy British troops there, which makes any ceasefire or peace impossible. You understand perfectly well why these statements are being made, precisely to prevent the achievement of any peace agreement on Ukraine.
But the reality is this: Russia is not willing to make any compromises. At best, they want Ukraine to surrender Donbas without a fight. At worst, they want to turn the entire country into a puppet state. Western partners are seriously considering stationing troops in western Ukraine after the war as one of possible security guarantees. Of course, Russia doesn't like that one bit. Here is the kicker: if Moscow really wants peace, as their propaganda claims, there shouldn't be any problem, right? Problems only show up when Russia is preparing for a third round of attacks, which, judging by everything, is exactly what's happening. And let's not forget, this war is far from over.
At the same time, you look at what's happening nearby and think, they're just outright. The British, who say, we'll send troops, we'll do this, we'll pull a brigade from the Baltics, a brigade from wherever they are, in Greece, and throw them into Ukraine. Well, with nuclear weapons, no doubt. The Danes are proud, saying there's even a full report being filmed showing, look how we're preparing what will kill Russians. Danes, a country you can barely find without a magnifying glass. A country that oppresses the local inhabitants of Greenland, who have developed Stockholm Syndrome. Bloodsuckers, clinging to what isn't theirs. Of course, we must fight for the freedom of Greenland, right now. And the Danish colonial authorities must be.
Meanwhile, in Russia, they are openly saying that a war with Europe is unavoidable. Never mind that it's mostly their own fears and fantasies. The important thing is to make their population believe a foreign threat is always looming. And while they shout about inevitable war, what Moscow is really doing is just looking for excuses for its own failures on the front lines and its domestic problems.
This conflict truly began as a local one. It originally started as coercion toward peace. Then it became local, and today we face the task of preventing an escalation. Sometimes purely irrational, from a local conflict, driven by Russophobia, first into a regional one, and then very quickly into a trans-regional conflict. Because in the current scenarios, it cannot be assumed that it will remain limited to the western frontier. The Northwest is already affected, our Arctic is already involved, and to think that there will be no battlefield there within the framework of a conflict with Europe would be extremely politically short-sighted.
Meanwhile, in Russia, the country that, according to Trump and Russians themselves, supposedly wants peace, they are back to threatening strikes on Ukraine. Now Solovyov is openly calling for bombing railways, which, let me remind you, are used by ordinary civilians. And it's not just the tracks, he specifically targets train stations in major Ukrainian cities. What is this, if not terror?
So they continue striking Belgorod. Explain to them, 1 week, Kharkiv will be off limits. Please, everyone, leave Kharkiv. And then start methodically demolishing, quarter by quarter. Similarly, we understand the entry points into Ukraine. There are 5 main ones. Then some ports must be destroyed. And further, if we talk about land routes, there aren't that many crossings. In my view, these should be struck with tactical nuclear weapons to create an exclusion zone. That way, no supplies will be possible. To stop railway movements, yes, one could try to blow up the tracks, or, for example, destroy the train stations in all major cities.
Solovyov is also worried about residents in Belgorod and Bryansk who supposedly suffer from Ukrainian strikes. But this is just a response. Russia only understands the language of force. Pull your terrorist troops out, and it all ends immediately. After all, the Russians know very well peace can be achieved quickly if they simply stop the aggression.
But I feel far more pity for the residents of Belgorod, Donetsk, Luhansk, the people of Crimea, the people of Bryansk, the residents of the cities being struck by Blaymet. Therefore, to all those residents of Ukraine who are waiting for us to stop, deal with it. Earn the right to be called true Ukrainians. And right now, who are you? You are miserable accomplices of a plane that kills your women and children, does nothing to protect them, kills them through its policies, its approach, its treachery. All of this is done for golden toilets. That's it.
Of course, we don't want to point fingers, but the real collaborator of this aggressive regime is obvious, and it's definitely not the Ukrainians. It's your dictator waging war against a peaceful neighbor just to stay in power and have at least one excuse to sit on his bloody throne. And the Russians keep supporting this. So while propagandists shot and tried to scare the world with nuclear threats or dragged out peace talks, the reality is simple. The war continues, and we need to stay united and not fall for Russian manipulation. That's all for today. While the Russian propaganda machine keeps running, we'll keep exposing their lies. I'm Sophia, and this was Spin Snipers. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and don't fall for their spin.